Oh, hey, you came. Cool, cool. So let me introduce myself. I'm Janis. Peace out. And I am here to talk to you about post-World War II 20th century literature. Yeah, the cool stuff. Yeah. So that's my speciality, because there isn't anybody here yet to rap to you about that. So this is what we're going to rap about. But before we can rap about a bit of mid-20th century to contemporary literature, we got to go way back to just after the First War and talk about modernism, because all of this stuff, all these isms and posts that we're going to discuss with our writers, they don't make any sense at all unless you understand the theoretical underpinnings. So, to understand the theoretical underpinnings, we got to go right back and we got to see what was happening for modernism, for postmodernism to be post. Hey. So, I'm going to rap with you about modernism and postmodernism for the next little while, so that when I see you again, you'll be caught up to speed. So, modernism in literature is characterized by a refusal of coherent meaning. So, we're not being absolutely like tie everything up with a nice little bow. We're being strange and unusual. We're also playing with language. So something like Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce is refusing a coherent meaning. In fact, it's using language in such an unusual way that it's almost unreadable. Not unreadable, but man, I don't have time for that. So that is one of the characteristics. That's the first characteristic of modernism. Second one is a rejection of realism. So we're rejecting that whole 19th century and very early 20th century notion of things being hyper-realistic. So, you know, if you think of like all those 19th century classics where we're living in a very real world, man, very straight world, we're rejecting that. So we can be all sorts of things. We also have subjectivities coming in. So we no longer have just a really stand back, I am a god type narrator. Instead, we get this really interior sort of world and a lot of stream of consciousness and a lot of free indirect discourse, which really pulls the whole thing into a very subjective point of view. There is no one standing outside rapping about how this all fits in. There is no Victor Hugo putting his whole story into a historical context, or Herman Melville going and telling us all about whaling for chapters on chapters on chapters, which is so boring. You have split temporalities, so things will move around. You're not bound to one particular time period. You can move within it. You have an unstable identity. So think of someone like Orlando, because Orlando changes from like a dude to a chick and lives for 400 years. I mean, not realistic in the least, but still, it's modern. That's modern, very modern Virginia Woolf's Orlando. You have idiosyncratic language. So like E. Cummings, not using any capitals. You have a lot of this kind of strange language. You have the of Finnegan when he falls off the ladder and people think he's dead. You have a lot of that sort of strange use, unorthodox use of language in Ulysses as well. You have experimental form. So like Ulysses, where it changes every single chapter, which is what makes it so damn hard to read. I have read it, but it's hard. That thing is hard to read. You have split identities. So something like J. Gatsby in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Very split identities. We're not sure who or what even The Great Gatsby is. You have a focus on interiority. So think of like that Mrs. Dalloway chick. Mrs. Dalloway chick, you know all about who she is as a woman and inside and all her history and her emotions. But honestly, I could not pick her up from a lineup of a whole load of other middle-aged London chicks because I have no idea what she looks like inside. And then you have also the unreliable narrator. And the unreliable narrator is like Nick from The Great Gatsby. I wouldn't believe Nick. I wouldn't believe Nick if you gave me $100. Just no way am I believing Nick. Nick Carraway is a self-serving little so-and-so. So that is something you get with the modernists. So modern writers give primacy to form, which results in experimentation. They looked right back to where her leadership is back in the 18th century, especially. They looked at that book that she did at the beginning, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. That guy did that. That was a big influence on what they did. So that experimentation, it breaks all those 19th century realist conventions. It celebrates unreliable and even split narrators. And it often explores themes around identity, which is more fluid and unstable than in the pre-modern literature. This is because they've just been through a huge cataclysmic war, a massive war that broke up everything that people thought was stable and straight. And this is what gave rise to this period. You have increased mechanizations. They were awful snobs. They were such shocking snobs. But you get this whole reevaluating of everything after this war that was, huge, groundbreaking. And it uses a lot of stream of consciousness and free indirect discourse, both of which were pre-existing literary devices, but not really much in use in 19th century literature. They really come into their own in modernism. Now, modernism didn't survive the war. Modernism, because a lot of the modernists were either communists or fascists. A lot of them were fascists. Because there were so many fascists in there and it was so easy to bring that fascist ideology into their writing, they really fell out of favor. You also had an even bigger war with an even bigger chance of complete and utter annihilation. And that gave rise to a whole new set of insecurities, because what's the point of tooling around the edges with things when we could all go boom tomorrow, man? And everything you trusted turns out to be, not what you thought it was. I am not a crook. So postmodern literature is characterized by an ambivalent stance towards realism. You can have very realistic looking novels, but you can also have very unrealistic looking novels. So think of something like Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which is very, very fantastical and realistic at the same time. So just because you can be realistic doesn't stop you taking flights of fancy. You have split temporalities, again, like the modernists. Remember, this is postmodern, so this is building on the modernists. So some things it takes beyond, other things it keeps. You have ironic narrators and a real use of irony. We're not just not trusting them, we're telling the whole story as one big gas here. It's not just a case of that I'm going to make you doubt your narrator. I'm going to use my narrator in an ironic fashion to poke fun at things. We use a whole load of metafiction. Metafiction, like in John Fowles, The French Lieutenant's Woman, where you become very aware of the act of reading, and the act of reading is what is under the microscope as much as the book itself. The John Fowles could be fairly right-wing. He had quite a few unpleasant attitudes, but still, very interesting piece of writing. Then, and I think Laura has talked about this, she's talked about this when she's been talking about history and what you can do with and what you can't do with history, because history is not a mirror held up to the world that tells you this is how it was and I have that authority man to tell you this is how it was. No. This uses a thing called histographic metafiction, which understands that all history is fed through and interpreted by the people who were rapping about it. So we end up with an idea that there is not one dominant narrative, but that there are multiple narratives, and each one has its own perspective. So what it means is that you go from having the great white male narrative to getting women's narratives and black narratives and indigenous narratives, and you get gay narratives and you get working class narratives, and all of these things come together and they influence one another. So, you know, a black chick is going to have a very different sort of subjectivity to a white chick, so her narrative is going to look different to the white chick's narrative, you see? So it makes everything a lot more complicated than it was in the past. You get fragmentation, so you can tell a story in fragments, but also that fragmentation of that authority as you start to get all these other narratives clawing in and saying, hey, we have a voice too, because, you know, we want to rap about our experience. You get multiple points of view. So books that have multiple points of view and no sense that this is going to be just a single thing, or that this is going to be, you know, any one person is going to have the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, man, because there ain't such a thing as that. You have a focus on exteriority. So it means, like in Don DeLino, in his White Noise, he's so focused on surfaces and the exterior of things and brand names. And a little thing about brand names is totally been done. Most people make you pull it out, so don't do that. Besides, you're just playing into the man. You know, we haven't trusted the man for a long while. You know, you don't have to just go with the man. So, we're focusing on the exterior things. We're not worried about the interior. We can, but it's not our primary focus. We're looking at the exterior, so I should know exactly what you look like, but I don't know whether you have a soul, and it's not really any of my business. We have pastiche and irony and black humor, which are all really great ways to, you know, point at the man and say, hey, that's not cool. That ain't cool. I don't jive with that. That is not good. I'm going to criticize you. I'm not going to be so arrogant as the modernists to offer a solution to what you are doing. But I'm going to say what you are doing is not working, because if I'm offering a solution, I just put myself in the place of the man, and I don't want to be the man. I'm not the man. You don't want to be the man, but we want to tell the man, we don't like what you're doing. We don't like what you're doing. And this is a way to do it. So there's also, finally, intertextuality. And intertextuality is where you take one text and create a new text from that text, and the reading of the two texts together creates a whole new meaning. So, for instance, like Margaret Atwood in the Penelopead, where she retold the Odyssey from Penelope's point of view, and actually not from Penelope, but from the murdered maids. She tells that story from their point of view and creates a whole different version of the Odyssey than the one that is presented in the traditional text. Postmodernism examines the nature of knowledge, both deconstructing established beliefs and purporting new interpretations. So, you know, that's where post-colonial writing comes in, that's where feminist writing comes in, that's where Marxist writing comes in, a whole load of different ways that you can interpret the world start to come in here. So the world isn't like it is just because it is. You'd lose that. Postmodern texts, unlike modernist texts, encourage the reader to consider the act of reading and creating meaning for themselves, like in Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, where he postulates that the author is no longer the man who holds all the knowledge, but the meaning of the text comes from both the text and the reader and their interpretation and their life experiences and their other reading experiences, and so they create meaning within themselves, which means that there is no stable meaning, that every reader has a new meaning for any given text. So that is where we are heading in this. It was really fun rapping to you today. I'm going to be bringing you some really cool writers. I'm going to be bringing you some guys. I'm going to be bringing you some chicks. I'm going to be bringing you some black writers. I'm going to be bringing you white writers. We're going to be having some fun. So, peace, and I will see all you groovy people later. Bye.